Good afternoon. So my name is Michel Lepetit, and I'm Vice President of the Shift project. I'm very happy to be here to talk about not that much Ecole, but I will talk about many things you will see that will be much simpler than the previous talk by Victor. It's just history. It's mostly history I'm going to talk about. Tomorrow there will be a talk about another subject, but this one is this is why I'm working a lot with Jean-Marc and many projects I would be very glad to talk about. It's linked with energy, climate, the transition, and so on. So this is a series of kind of project or association I'm working on. And I remind people that there will be an event at the academic share in economics, energy and prosperity about secular stagnation and energy, and I'm going to talk about secular stagnation right now. In fact, this paper is closely linked to the theme of secular stagnation in economy. First, an introduction. I'm going to talk about the introduction, about maybe a novel you know. Who have already read Flowers for Algernon? That's all. Oh. Well, that's one of the best-known science fiction book written in the 60s by Daniel Keyes. It's about the rise and fall of a simple mining guy. He's a QE of 60. He has something is happening to him. He meets an expert in brain surgery, and so his Q is multiplied by 3. So he becomes the most intelligent and clever man on earth. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So inescapably, he has a decline, and the story in Algernon is the story written and said by this guy. Very simple. At the beginning, he writes with a lot of difficulties. Then he becomes a genius, and there is a fall at the end. So it's a book about rise and fall. It's a book about technology and science, and about society. Read it. It's a very good. So this is a kind of growth and decline you could have in this book. In fact, it's not. This growth and decline is a graph you have in a book, in a paper which is very famous, written by Robert Gordon, who is an economist. And I like a lot Robert Gordon, but I'm going to criticize a lot what he's done. Robert Gordon talks about the rise and fall of the US economy. And in fact, he talks about the global economy. But he talks about this slowdown we have, which he doesn't call secular stagnation. But from now, for 4 years or 5 years, everybody has been talking about secular stagnation. And the link is done with the work by Gordon about productivity and growth. And there is another guy who we talk tomorrow, who is Larry Summers. And Larry Summers used the word secular stagnation. So the point is that we had from the 13th century, we had no growth, according to this graph. Then this is England. This is United States growth. This is the growth per year. And even Gordon is saying we are on the decline. And it goes on, you know. In all the papers by the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, now we talk about the secular stagnation, and Gordon is cited. So he's very, very famous, Robert Gordon. I will talk about Gordon, and I will use words. He doesn't use that much. I will talk about energy and crude oil. I will have a world view. Mostly, Gordon talks about the US. Of course, US is what comes first, and then there will be other countries, but I will talk about worldview. I will start in 1951, where Gordon started sooner. I will talk about money, and Gordon never talks about finance and money, never. I will talk about history and data, as he does. So the presentation will be not in 2 parts. There are 2 tracks. The first track is analysis of the Gordon work. What does he say, especially in the last book, the rise and fall pattern. He focused about the 70s. In his books, he talks a lot of times, you will see, about the 70s, what happened in that time. I'm born from the 60s, but I remember the 70s. He talks a lot about inventions, technology, TFP. So there is a close link with what was said just previously by Victor. What is technology? What is progress? So I will criticize a lot what is going to be said, or what is said, sorry. And I will try to put some ideas from economic history about the 70s, especially, mostly on the 70s. And I will, if I have time, I don't know if I have time, I will talk about finance. We'll see. So The Rise and Fall of the American Growth is a very good book. It's 784 pages. Very big book. He wrote other books, but now I think it's one of the last one. I think he put a lot of things in it. So read it. It's very good. Very good. So first he says that he starts from the 70s previous century and say, well, we had growth in the United States until the 70s, and then we had this very bizarre phenomenon that not degrowth, but slowing down growth. He talks a lot about progress with the solo one view we've talked about. There is labor, there is capital, and there is technology, total factor productivity. It doesn't talk that much about capital, but it talks a lot in his book about labor. The time you spend, who was working, and so on. And he says that the 70s was the key point, and one of the arguments is that from the 70s, finally, there are not that much innovation. That's why there is a slowdown.
Computers?
You'll see. I won't spend too much time on computers, but here it's an extract from the famous paper. I think it's a 2012 paper from Gordon. And you see the focus on the 70s. You know, there are different time periods, and there is something happening in the 70s. It shows 72, and here is the labor productivity, and he points that before 72, you had high productivity, and then it's slower, and there is a period where it's a little bit higher, and there is a link with data processing, with internet, and so on. But mostly, he says, it was high, it's much lower, and it's very low at the end of the story.
It's not true.
These are figures. So you can say it's not true, but there are figures from the economics.
The data this morning.
Okay. These are the figures from Gordon, and he says from different periods, especially between 1920 and 1970 in the US, you had high productivity. So this is time scale, this is productivity. So it was high, it's low. And there is this period, there is where there is data processing and the ICT. And he had a comment, he likes to, if you have time, you read the comment, he proposed to the audience, if you have to choose between water, how do you call that? Water into your dwelling and indoor toilets, or internet, what would you choose? The answer is obvious, of course, but he says that people usually prefer to have toilets and water than the internet, because the internet is not that much important. That's a key point. So there is a lot of debate these days at the IMF, at the OECD, about what is technology and why we don't see the results of all these improvements by the internet, by Facebook and Twitter, which are wonderful game, as you know. This is the consequence you see in the literature. This is, for instance, maybe I mentioned it. It is a report for the Obama president at the US. Every year there is a report to the president. In the report, they put what I like to see. I call it the LPT modeling, macroeconomic modeling. You see the actual growth, and this is a simulation. What should be the the growth of the economy each year? I know that Jean-Marc likes it too. In fact, it's not asymptotic long-term productivity limit back to trend. It's après la pluie, le beau temps. This is I already mentioned, but you have to say that it will be better. You have to say so. Even if it's decreasing and it's going with a slowdown, you have to mention that, because if you do not, it's as you know, it's self-predicting. So every year the IMF is very optimistic. In this paper, which is there is a debate which is launched in France. It was 2 weeks ago. There will be a discussion about what's going for the growth, the world growth. And in this paper, there is you should have it on the internet. It's in French, unfortunately. It talks about secular stagnation, the growth, productivity, and all these problems. This is once again from the report to the President Obama, published 2 weeks ago. This is productivity since the 50s, and you see for many countries what's happening. This is from a paper from Larry Summers, so the other economist I remember that Larry Summers wanted to be head of the Fed instead of Janet Yellen. But Larry Summers is talking a lot about productivity, growth. And this is a graph from the 60s to present time where he shows that US growth is always lower each time. It's decreasing compared to the previous trends. And this paper was written by, it's a recent paper by Larry Summers and Blanchard, who has, Blanchard was the head of the economist from the IMF. And this is shorter period of time, but to tell you that it's a very present problem, because as you know, this slower growth, we start to see it in China. And many people are wondering what's happening in China. So you have the industrial production from 2011 right now for different parameters, but we are not in the good direction. So I will criticize. I come back now to Robert Gordon. I will criticize many things about Gordon, but first of all, of course, he doesn't speak at all about energy. Never. Ah oui. So I will talk about crude oil. I've chosen crude oil because I think mixing energy is quite complex. We are always talking in this room about energy as a key. I don't think there is energy. There are many kinds of energy, and well, year after year, we have specialized energy. Of course, there is electricity and oil, but even in oil, as mentioned by Jean-Marc a few days ago, crude oil is quite different from other oil. And crude oil is the best of all energy, far from other form of energy. So I will talk about crude oil. I will talk about money, if I sometimes, about currency and credit. I will talk about the rest of the world, because the US is interesting, but there are other parts. So my figures and my data will be from the world. I will talk about events, because very bizarrely, in the books of Gordon, he talks about inventions, innovations, but not that much about events. Of course, he talks about the war, and the part of the book on the Second World War is very interesting about productivity, because he thinks that the war, of course, increased a lot technology at that time. Very good. This is a graph I've done. These are my data for world GDP and world crude oil production. So you see what can be seen in this graph. I think the numbers are big enough for Charles, because I have the same problem. So in blue, you have world GDP growth. In black, it's crude oil growth. Sorry, it's written small. So crude oil, GDP. The gray zone is between the year, and you see this gray zone very often between the years 73 and 82. I call it the Great Transition. And what can you see? You see what's very well known. They are quite synchronized, of course. It's not causation, it's correlation. There is a very strong correlation between crude oil supply and GDP. And there is two periods. Well, there are three periods. There is this grand transition with a big, bizarre phenomenon which happened in this period. Very, very bizarre. And I call them the first oil shock and the second oil shock, as you know them. But before that, as you see, world oil supply, crude oil supply was higher than GDP. And after that, crude oil supply was lower. What you can see on this graph too is this catastrophe in 2008, very well known. This is a great, they call it at the Bank of International Settlement, the great financial crisis. You can see this very bizarre thing. Maybe Gael talked about that. We had higher GDP at that time than the oil. Why? People can think there is something to do with the crisis coming just thereafter, but maybe assets were overvalued. And what else can I say? That's all for the moment. And yes, what you can see, I didn't do that, but decade after decade, in fact, there is a slowdown. But globally, you have the figures at the top for this period and this period, and you can see the figure there, and the growth in crude oil and GDP. So there is a rise and fall. This one is very famous, you already know that, but I did it again in log presentation of supply and world GDP in this long period. So you have the first period before the great transition and the two oil shock. These are two oil shock, and this is the period we are in, and we are at that point because I go until 2015. I have a little bit estimation for 15 because we don't have the December figures, but still. That's all I have to say. So my first critique of Gordon's book is when you read it. It's very interesting. When you read it, and he talks about innovation, he writes, well, you read that. So he said that, in fact, there are many innovations. And he talks about water, and about medicine. But at the end of the day, he says that the two most important innovation in more than 100 years, it's electricity and the internal combustion engine. So it's very difficult not to talk about energy. You know, electricity seems not to be an energy. That's a problem. But you can say it's not. It's produced by other energy. And the internal combustion engine doesn't work with nothing else but oil. So it's very, very bizarre to say so. This is linked with a trend in economics. Well, many economists talk about the GPT. No, it's a kind of fashion to talk about this general purpose technology. In GPT, there is discussion about electricity, internal combustion engine or not. We talk about steam. We talk about your technology, so it's information and communication technology, ICT. And, but there is a lot of argument, what is real GPT? But in fact, it says that the two GPTs, which are electricity and the internal combustion engine, which work with oil, are the most important of all. That's a key point for me. And I can tell you that it's difficult to find the word energy in the 784 pages. I mailed to Robert Gordon 2 years ago. Sorry. I mailed to Robert Gordon to say, why don't you talk about energy? All you're talking about is energy. Why don't you say it's energy? The answer was, well, it was said by Mr. Schwartz, I don't know which economist in the 70s. He doesn't want to talk about that. A break. Here you have a break. So I talk about something else. But this is my personal view about what is really energy and what is really technology. It was written by an anthropologist mentioned by Charles Hall, which was Leslie White. And Leslie White just said that what is important is to have energy and technology, and you need both to make product. We call them product. And it looks very simple to think so. It's not very bizarre. I'm an engineer, from my background is engineer, but it seems very simple. And unfortunately, Leslie White is not that famous, but read him. He wrote very good books. So the discussion of GPT, for instance, these days there are papers in the academic literature about the use of course, the use of electricity. And the amount of electricity here is between the beginning of the century, last century, and just before the Second World War. And what was the amount of electricity per worker in the United States and many countries? And people are discussing what was the productivity, the improvement, and the link with GDP. So this is a way of seeing labor productivity for worker in the industry. I did my own. So my own is a very new data you've never seen. This is oil supply, crude oil supply per employee people in the world. So I use Madison series, time series. And what you see, of course, the beginning of the 50s and the 60s, I mentioned previously. So there's this incredible growth, but there's incredible growth even if the population is increasing very, very fast at the time. In 73, you have 37 liters, no, 37 barrels of oil per day per employee worldwide. Then you have this very bizarre period. You know, it decreased. Then in the 70s, I remember this period of the second oil shock. It decreased until 92. And from 82 to 2014, we went from 30 barrels to 25 barrels per employee.
It's not barrels. It cannot be barrels.
Or say liters.
It's probably liters.
It might be liters. Maybe I missed the liters. Yes, I think it's liters, because it's too many barrels. So you have and it's quite regular decrease. So this is really per employed people. I don't remember the number of employed people in today, but it's, of course, it's roughly the population between 20 years old and I would say 65 years old. So the question I would ask to Robert Gordon, how do these people put less and less oil in their internal combustion engine? A few words about the second point about the book of Gordon. He never talks about money. I will just a few lights on them. Of course, the debate on secular stagnation is mostly about the interest rates, the markets, and the money. So these are the figures maybe you know, you don't. On the same time period, you have the inflation in the US. I put the US figures because it's the most obvious. And I put in red, you have the 10 years interest rate in the US. So you see bizarre things during this great transition, and from then, it just a slowdown, and it goes to the period we know, or maybe you've heard about that, which is called the ZLB, the zero lower bound, the fact that interest rates are touching zero. In fact, it's a very long process. You have still economists thinking that the world was created by God in 2008, but it's not true. It started before. Some economists are saying that things started at least from the 80s. And they talk a lot about the 70s and the 80s, what happens. And they talk about Gordon. So there is a link between the view of Robert Gordon about productivity, growth, and now the view that things are very bizarre, this trend, this long-term trend, which leads us until it's not just caused by the catastrophe we had in 2008, as you remember, with the near collapse of the markets. But the cause is much older than that. So very quickly, for instance, in the report to the president, there is the mention that never the inflation, except in 2009, the inflation has been so low. And he mentioned also that many countries now have negative rates. How much time do I have? Time. I'm in the planning. So now I will put some arguments. No, that's true.
Hey, you want a discussion or you don't want a discussion?
No. I'm more than that. So I will provide some historical arguments. Until now, I just said it's a correlation between energy and GDP. Now I will try to explain what could be a causation of what happened in the 70s. The first argument is that the 70s crisis, which is the most often is said that it was a Yom Kippur War crisis, as you remember, with the oil embargo, and it was quite complex. I would say that nothing to do with that, nothing. So I don't want to rewrite history, but even if you look in the books now, people talk less and less about the Yom Kippur War, which was quite interesting. I was young, I remember reading the papers with the invasion of across the canal by the Egyptians and so on, but the truth is that whatever would have happened, it was impossible to go on the way it did. It was just impossible. So I will provide three arguments for that. It was impossible for Saudi Arabia to produce the oil. It was impossible for the world globally to produce this oil. And it was unsustainable for the US because something had happened just a few years before. They had reached their peak oil. I would give a posteriori argument to explain this was really impossible, which is linked to what happened in the last 10 years. And I will talk a little bit about the history of finance to give some clues. So this is a long time history of oil, crude oil. You see in black, this is the world production, and it is on the right. So we are around 80 million barrels per day of crude oil these days. This is the last figures from the energy EIA, I don't remember. So you have the phenomena of what happened during the two oil shocks. So you have this exponential growth, two oil shocks and the new trend.
What is the green line?
The green line is Saudi Arabia. This is the production, and the green line are on the left side. So you see Saudi Arabia climbing very fast. Then there is a counter shock, as you remember, and the new production. So it's around 10 million barrels per day. And here you see the American oil. You see on this graph the share of oil per United States. So for instance, in the 20, yes, I don't know if yes, it's bigger. In the 20, America share of oil was 90% of worldwide oil. And it decreased. This is Middle East in green. So Middle East, before the shock, was around 40%. And this is Saudi Arabia, which is part of the Middle East. So at the time of the oil shock, the US and Saudi Arabia were around 20%, well, 17% each of world oil production. So in blue you have this one. What I just wanted to say is you see the trend, and I can tell you see the trend of the Saudi Arabia oil. My first point is obvious. It was not possible to go on for many years. The call for the oil from Saudi Arabia was just amazing. The growth was just obviously unsustainable. It even increased because of the peak oil of the US. I have no time to. So, first thing to say is this growth, this is the same graph but shorter. This growth was unsustainable for the call for Saudi Arabia. The trend was amazing. For the whole world, I would say it was impossible to. Here in orange, you have a forecast by Exxon. Well, it's not Esso, but it's the same. This is a forecast just a few weeks before the oil shock. So you see the growth. This is the growth they were forecasting for the world oil worldwide. As you see, even now, we are lower compared to what they said we would be in the 80s, at the end of the 80s. So even worldwide, it was not possible to produce so much oil. This is the second argument. I'll give you an example. So this is the forecast from Exxon. Even Exxon, sorry, it's in French, but it says, if you see the demand, the production of oil, and if you have a projection, you say it would give you vertigo. Try to do that. At one time, he said even you will need several Americas to produce so much oil. And the third argument is from the United States now. We have an event which is very important in the worldwide community, which is called Bretton Woods, which was over in 1971. It happened in the middle of August, in the 15th of August. Nixon chose to stop Bretton Woods, which was a key element in the worldwide organization of the financial world. Here are figures, and I have many data. I've been working on that for 4 years now, so I have many data on what happened exactly in the 70s, the figures and the data. Obviously, as soon as they reached the peak oil, and I think a little bit before, but really during the peak oil, the United States were aware it was impossible to go on that way. We would have to restrict the demand of oil. You know that the demand of oil, well, you know that the elasticity of oil to price is quite close to zero, as you remember. So to decrease the demand on oil, you have to make explosion of the price of oil. I know, I suppose everybody knows that. So I won't spend too much time on elasticity, but so they knew from November 70 something would happen. On this figure, you have the import and the consumption by the US. It's not the same scale on the two sides. So here are the imports in in 1,000 barrels, so it's 1 million barrels. And they were importing around 1 million barrels per day for many years. And then, as you see, it started to skyrocket. Around 74, they were around 5 million barrels per day. And here is a consumption So it was around 11 million barrels at that time, and then it went until 13 million barrels. And here I put the price. What happened to the price during that period, from $1.21 per barrel to 10.9 per barrel. My point is very simple. Whatever, even if there was no war, there was no solution but to have a huge, huge, huge increase in the price of oil to restrict consumption compared to what was going on. The embargo is here. The embargo was just a political weapon, but without embargo, there would have been an incredible increase in the price of oil at that time for this very reason. Of course, there's a lot of debate about Bretton Woods. I'm the only one to say that it's, well, I'm not the only one, but not that many people say that Bretton Woods is linked with oil. This is the trade balance of the United States. I can show you the figures about what happened to the trade balance. It was the first time US would be negative since 1830-something, you know. It was just unbelievable. So when Nixon took his decision, he knew very well what was going on. He knew the price of oil, of the import of oil, would be just much too high for the US. So they choose to break Bretton Woods in the middle of August. This is a discourse by Richard Nixon just a few weeks before. It's not there is another discourse you'll see next slide, but this discourse is just 2 months before when he said energy is very important. Maybe some of you remember, energy is very important. The United States has to think about energy, and we have to improve the quality of air. You know, there was even an ecological argument by Richard Nixon at the time. I can tell you this was not the point at all. This is the discourse when Richard Nixon said this is the end of Bretton Woods. And the argument was, this is a peacetime. So you see so among economists, but among historians, that Bretton Woods is linked to the war, the Vietnam War. There are two arguments. There is the social spending by the US government, the Kennedy times, and the other argument is the war. I have no time for the other arguments, but this is the number of soldiers, US soldiers in the Vietnam at the time. We are in 71, you know. You can tell you what you want. I think the argument is just worthless. This was the end of the Vietnam War. It was already programmed, as you can see. So we had this great transition for me, just amazingly important worldwide. We changed the world. We had this kind of growth before. We have this other kind of growth since. I just show two consequences, you know. We tried to get rid of oil wherever possible. For instance, in electricity production, we removed all we could as electricity power with oil. This is the figures. And we put some money, for instance, in nuclear energy, as you already know. And of course, we try to find other oil. And here are new data I will show you. This is, you've never seen that. I tried to compute the capex in oil and gas, because it's very difficult not to have oil and gas. So this is the capex in oil and gas. Yes, oil and gas since the 60s. It's more difficult for the 50s. And it's a lot of proxy, because I mix many series, many datas. So you see the first oil shocks. So the capex went from 0.2 of the GDP, world GDP, to 1% of GDP. And then you have the counter shock. And this is the new period we had recently, as you all know. And the capex went even a little bit higher. What's interesting in this diagram is there are two things. So we know the results of this capex. We found new oil. We discovered offshore oil. We started new kinds of oil very quickly. And there was a counter shock then. There was so much oil that we were drawing in oil, as you remember. There is this period, and there is this very bizarre things, because as you know, you don't see anything here. There is nothing to see. We spend...
Oil was $150 a barrel.
Sorry?
In the middle of 2008, oil was $150 a barrel.
Yeah, this is volumes. This is not price. So what you see is that it doesn't change anything of the production of oil. So I come back. So there is first things, it seems very difficult to find oil, as you all know. And the second point is what's going to happen, because we never seen that, such a decrease. I remember we were spending around $750 billion per year as capex for. This is not a small figure. It's not that high, $750 billion, but quite a large amount of money. We are still spending quite a lot of money, but it's much lower. And once again, the figures, you could see a small increase, but not that much. What you see is the shale oil here, of course. This is the US production, and you can see the oil production in the US has been skyrocketing. But globally, you didn't give the money. Well, the return is not that high. And maybe you know that, in fact, we have a second peak oil for the US, because production has been decreasing for last year in crude oil, and it's lower than it was at that time. Because I wanted to talk a little bit about the EROI, what about the global energy capex? I've been working on that for last year. These are the figures globally for the world, from the famous study by the EIA, International Energy Agency. So they say that the global capex is around $1.7 trillion per year. It will be for year coming. I think the figures are quite close to what they were 2 years ago. A big part will be in capex for oil or for gas. Here you find again around $700 billion per year. And a large part of the capex is in power, in electricity. In fact, if you have the capex for electricity and the capex for oil and gas exploration and production, you have the largest part of the capex for energy worldwide. So I try to work, but there are a lot of hypotheses in the graph, but I try to find out, starting with the production of electricity worldwide on many projects, in a long time series from the 64 until now, what was spent on electricity capex. So once again, it's around 1% of GDP, and it was quite high. There is a crisis, a 70 crisis, and it decreased. And here, of course, what you see is China. So you have the huge growth of China and investment by China in electricity. In fact, you have the same thing for oil, as you imagine. It's the growth of China which made the increase of price of oil and to take their share.
Why is there a decrease between the 70s and
here? I think it's linked with the capex we put in nuclear. I think, not sure, in nuclear. We had a rush to quit as quickly as possible oil. That's why I say that oil is very, very, very different from electricity. Our energy are quite separate now, and you cannot replace oil by anything now. It was even difficult before, and it's even more difficult now. Now we have the two shocks, the first shocks and the second shocks we had in the last decade. I think it will be awful to change. Yes, Charles?
Well, the price of oil went way down from 1980 until 1995 or something, and the oil companies had enormous less money. When they have a lot of money, they use it, and they drill more, and they do all kinds of capital expenditures.
Yeah.
I think it's very simple.
No, this graph, of course, this graph here, the link between the price of oil and the capex in oil is quite, I don't show the graph because you know, all of you know it. It's totally linked. When the price of oil is high, capex in oil is high. It's that simple. For electricity, it's more complex. I think it's more complex. This is EROI. It's a very simple EROI, given from my figures, because I use the capex from oil and gas, and I just use, in the division, I just use crude oil supply. So I should put gas and I don't have the figures for gas. So it's a kind of capex. I think gas is linked to oil. It's close, but not that much. And what you see is you have a low rate in just before the crisis. Well, at the time of the crisis, we were just using a small part of oil production for the capex. We were not ready for the crisis. In fact, there was no readiness for the crisis, so it's quite low. It's around 5%. Then we had this, what I've called the drawing in oil from the economists, because in 94, the price of oil was very, very low. It was under $10 per barrel. So it seems that we were using a huge part of this oil because the capex was still not that low. So you have a capex compared to the oil production, which is quite high. And this is what's happening these days. And it's very bizarre because you see this is a point which is quite good for 2015. And in 2016, we are still spending a lot of money in the capex compared to the price.
The value of the production.
Yeah, it's just value. It's dollar. I have the capex in dollars. I have the production of oil in dollars. Of course, there is a mistake of royalties and so on because I put all the production at the market price. So if I have no longer time, it's over.
More or less,
Just one single graph, which is in my paper, is just to show what happened in the financial world. So you have this great transition, always the same date. This is for the US only, but I could have the same figures for other countries. For France, it's very famous. You know, here you see the government spending on GDP. So the debt, these are all debt. This is the US government debt starting to increase from 50% to 100% here. In France, it's just the same. In France, it was decreasing since the Second World War, and then poof, it skyrocketed after the crisis. Here is non-financial sector. So you see the importance of the 92 point, because the world totally changed with many, we all know very well in the financial sectors. It's all the deregulation of the financial sectors. In 92 in the US, in 93 in the UK, in 94, very famous in France because we have many laws creating this pure market, very efficient market, but especially we unleashed the credit was unleashed for private banks at the time. And I mentioned Mr. Draghi. I don't know what he's going to do this afternoon, but Mr. Draghi said there are no limits to how far. This is a world where there is no limits in finance compared to physics. We are going to the zero lower bound. I already said we are now in the lower bound. I mentioned, so this is the end. We are Charlie. We are slowing down and slowing down. We are going in a new, from my point of view, we are entering a new phase, a new period of history. I think it's history to be at the zero lower bound. It has been now quite 1,000 years without negative interest rates. So it's quite, Mr. Aldan from the Bank of England said 5,000 years, but I would just say 1,000 because there was not that much interest rates at the beginning of the Middle Age. So we have to work on the microeconomics. I think macroeconomics, we've been talking with Victor this afternoon, but there is a real problem in macroeconomics, and I would like, and we have to work with the IPCC on that, because the IPCC in the scenario on the climate is saying very bizarre things. We have now the ZLB, the zero lower bound. I will talk about tomorrow symptom, which is quite dangerous. And I would like personally to work more with the finance industry, to work on the energy transition. I can tell you it's a lot of work. Just last 2 points. I think this is totally wrong, I'm sorry to say, but my knowledge of economic history, I'm seeing about the GPT, and I would like to have the GPT, the general purpose technology. I think we should consider coal, gas, oil, and nuclear, and biomass, of course, but we should consider hydro, wind, peat, and wood. We have to work much more on wood in this period. It's much more complex than that. And I have finished. Just to say that Charlie, the hero of the Flowers for Argolon, Charlie is, his name is Charlie Gordon. Thank you.